Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, all right. What if Britain kept the Oregon Territory? I'm not sure. This is a great channel though. I watched what if Austria united the German state rather than Prussia. That was a really cool video and interesting. Let's go. My name's Connor. If you are new, I like to react to things and learn about stuff. Hit all the buttons.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Stick around until the very end to hear more. In the natural expansion of the United States and of Britain's colonies in what would become Canada, an eventual overlap was reached at the Pacific coast,
right?
A territory known by the United States as Oregon.
They got Vancouver Island though, even though that kind of split, didn't they? Okay, sorry.
And to Britain as Columbia. The territory was tremendously valuable to British Canada and to the United States for its coastal access to the Pacific, a coast which, though contested, was unoccupied by Spanish Mexico to the south or Russian Alaska to the north. The territory was largely divided into north and southern halves by the Columbia River, with the area immediately surrounding the river serving as the major region of settlement by both groups. The land was fertile, allowing great opportunity for agricultural development, and the Columbia not only connected the inlands to the Pacific Ocean, but to various other American and Canadian water systems as well, making transport and travel.
It's interesting how few country borders are this straight. I'm trying to think of other ones that are not only straight, but really, large borders as well. And there got to be a few African countries, like Chad and Sudan or Libya, and maybe over in Africa, but I can't think of any others that are just so straight. And I guess it's because the more recent your country was created, the more kind of convenient you can just set the border across, I guess. And, usually it's on rivers or whatnot. Okay.
Pacific Ocean, but to various other American and Canadian water systems as well, making transport and travel to the region all the easier. Now, rather than populating the unclaimed land in the fashion we might imagine, it was originally only used as a fur trapping and trading outpost, as well as a port for potential trade with China. Thus, American and British companies were the first to stake claims within the territory and the first to settle the region with their own employees. This amounted to a very small population of only a few hundred, if even that, and these weren't populations given to tremendous growth over time, mind you, but at the very least they were a presence which reinforced either country's territorial claim. For years, Britain and the United States had enjoyed positive political relations under the Federalist Washington and Adams administrations.
Benjamin.
However, that quickly changed under the following Democratic-Republican administrations of Jefferson and Madison. These tense relations eventually grew into full-blown hostility in 1812 when the United States, in retaliation for various infringements of their sovereignty by Britain, launched an invasion of Canada with the intent of liberating it from imperial rule. The Canadians, however, refused this forceful proposition and retaliated, bringing Britain and the US into all-out war. Britain, being preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe at the time, found themselves emphasizing the local conflict instead of that in North America, and as a result left the 1812 war without a
I just thought of something. So you not only had, Great Britain was able to, Great Britain, it shows how strong they were at this point compared to everyone else and us. So you were able to burn down the White House while fighting Napoleon, right? Were you fighting Napoleon? When did Waterloo happen? Was it 1815? Battle of Waterloo. Yeah, Sunday, 18th of June, 1815. So yeah, and the burning down of the White House was in 1814. Okay.
Clear winner. While the main fronts of the war America, and as a result left the 1812 war without a clear winner. While the main fronts of the war stood along the Great Lakes and along the southern Gulf, on the opposite coast still remained the Oregon Territory, sparsely populated and very well disconnected from the population centers of the United States. Boasting naval supremacy in both the Atlantic and Pacific, Britain could have very easily dispatched a small group of warships to capture and occupy the territory with little to no resistance during the war. The American Fur Company, recognizing this and seeing the loss of its holdings during the conflict as inevitable, willingly sold off its possessions to Britain in order to not suffer a total loss. This sale had provided Britain near complete control of Oregon settlements, and given the outcome of the war, left many suspecting that Oregon, or rather Columbia, would remain in British hands, but it didn't. Though Britain now dominated the region, and if it wished and given the outcome of the war, left many suspecting that Oregon, or rather Columbia, would remain in British hands, but it didn't. Though Britain now dominated the region and if it wished to could have put an end to American designs for Oregon right then and there, efforts were instead made by both countries to improve Anglo-American relations and prevent another war of this kind, and for very understandable reasons. For the United States, it could not afford to continue.
Look how big the Louisiana Purchase is. It's like a mirror image of what was there before. Insane.
Continue fearing Canada as an immediate threat on its border if successful settlement of the newly acquired Louisiana territory was to be achieved. Likewise, Britain couldn't have success. For the United States, it could not afford to continue fearing Canada as an immediate threat on its border if successful settlement of the newly acquired Louisiana territory was to be achieved. Likewise, Britain couldn't afford to continue wasting its resources fighting the United States in fruitless North American wars when its rivals on the European continent remained an ever-present threat and new lands overseas beckoned British settlement. Anglo-American peace simply appeared the most pragmatic solution to meet the long-term desires of
the British had the United Arab Emirates too, huh? Wow, they had India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, with Bhutan and Nepal thrown in there. But I know all of that was just India back then. But it's crazy how India is like the I think it's going to surpass China as the most populous country in the world. But it's got like 1.3, 1.4 billion people. I may be a bit off, but not much. And Pakistan and Bangladesh, I believe, are both in the top 10 still. And so all three of those would have been added on. Probably over 100 million in Bangladesh and over 100 million in Pakistan. I mean, just add that on top of it. Yeah.
Of both parties, but this did entail an unspoken surrendering of North America to US rule, whilst the US was expected to remain out of Britain's business both abroad and where it presently existed in North America. As for the disputed Oregon Territory, Britain, rather than claiming it entirely, proposed dividing the territory along the Columbia River, which would leave the most valuable settlements on Britain's side of the divide. The US, however, refused, desiring at minimum a continuation of the 49th parallel border. Unable to agree on an outcome, Britain allowed for a policy of joint occupation, at least until a mutually satisfactory partition could be decided upon, or as they anticipated, the region was decisively developed by one of the two countries. Overestimating their own window of opportunity and the advantage of naval supremacy, Britain slowly expanded its fort settlements while the US, over the course of 2 decades, wildly swung circumstances in their favor to the point that Britain could no longer retake the territory even by military means.
Wow, so that's really behind the sort of manifest destiny thing, just getting your people out there so that there's no squabble around whose territory is here. It's like, no, look at how many American settlers are out there living there already. And so that's a big part of the push and why the government was so seemingly generous with, all right, just go claim it and it's yours. And, however many plots of land or whatnot.
Following its original losses, the US did not pursue the further establishment of lucrative resource extraction companies.
I love that painting.
In the region.
I gotta stop pausing.
The US did not pursue the further establishment of lucrative resource extraction companies in the region, or rather initially attempted to, only to be immediately outcompeted. So instead, the US encouraged the transportation of valuable resources to the region, along with large populations of Americans to settle and develop Oregon with said resources, creating communities which could not only sustain themselves but grow at a steady pace and, in time, vastly outnumber the British, whose population in the region remained largely comprised of financially invested trappers and hunters. The Oregon Trail, a trail established over the years by American trappers, would prove crucial to facilitating this mass migration.
Couldn't the British have incentivized Canadians to do the same? I'm sure there weren't as many Canadians as Americans at this time either, but just, keep going west-west.
And in the span of only 5 years, the American population of Oregon would rise from around 200 in 1840 to 5,000 by the year 1845, rising again to 12,000 by 1850, while the British population never exceeded 1,500. Much as had occurred when Mexico invited American settlers to act as a buffer against native raids in the sparsely populated state of Texas, so had Britain's acceptance of joint occupation allowed the United States to eventually overwhelm the territory with its unmatched numbers on the continent.
Get over there.
With a disproportionately American population inhabiting Oregon and a new, more expansionist administration taking seat in the United States, Britain could read the writing on the wall and fear that their stake in not merely the southern territory was under threat, but that—
What was that? I'm not great with is that Polk or Tyler?
Britain could read the writing on the wall and fear that their stake in not merely the southern territory was under threat, but that Canada might be completely cut off from the Pacific if the US truly did move forward with its stated goal of annexing as far north as the 54th parallel, a territory known as New Caledonia, which would later become the basis of the British Columbia province of Canada. As the American Fur Company had done so before with Britain, so now did Britain compromise with the US, surrendering the Oregon Territory south of the 49th parallel.
There's also this weird thing in the top of Minnesota, the Lake of the Woods, little jutting out, where, I'm not sure if people live there, but I think if they did, they'd have to, every time they go to school, they'd have to cross technically into Canada. I'm not positive.
While retaining the less developed and less populated New Caledonia to the north. The American cut of the territory would go on to become the states of Washington and of course Oregon, while Britain's remnant claims once again evolved into the Canadian province of British Columbia, which even still the US would later attempt to annex. But what if all that changed? What if Britain was able to maintain control of the entire Oregon, or rather Columbia, territory? As we already mentioned, Britain had missed their window of opportunity to extensively settle or develop Columbia, focusing instead on international matters during this time. Realistically, even if Britain managed to populate Columbia with the same success they had seen in, say, Australia, this would not be enough to definitively secure it from American control, and if anything would only make a war for control of Columbia all the more likely, now that both the US and Britain held a formidable presence in the region. Some might argue that Britain could theoretically settle Columbia as thoroughly as it had the 13 colonies, however the initial colonization of North America was a very unique circumstance in which international competition favored investment in the New World. By the 1800s, European focus had shifted elsewhere, and investment in North America would only be a distraction from other more promising prospects.
I mean, it's on the Pacific coast, not the. It's obviously going to be much more complicated than being on the Atlantic coast.
In all fairness, Columbia's position on the west coast gives it the dual function of providing both direct land access to North America and a clear shipping route to Asia and the Pacific. That being said, Britain is still spread far wider across the globe than it had been during initial colonization, making heavy investment in Columbia a demanding task. One they need to achieve in a span of only 2 decades instead of the nearly 2 centuries it took to settle the 13 colonies. We might also suppose a timeline in which the Oregon Trail simply never existed. Up until the discovery of gold in California in 1848, the Oregon Trail had been the foremost path to follow to reach the western coast. It had been responsible for transporting thousands and later tens of thousands. Up until the discovery of gold in California in 1848, the Oregon Trail had been the foremost path to follow to reach the western coast. It had been responsible for transporting thousands and later tens of thousands of Americans to the territory. Without it, even in the absence of greater settlement efforts by Britain, the American population could be expected to remain a minority within the region, fewer and fewer daring to make the difficult journey in small groups as Oregon became increasingly British in character and in policy. But this would likely take too long, and once again there is a window of opportunity for this to be achieved. That being prior to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would have given the United States the tremendous advantage of being—
That's such a cool moment, connecting. Just finally, because they built it from both ways. Imagine like going all the way and being like, shit, or shoot, Jeffro. Like we use different rail sizes or something. All right, sorry.
Able to rapidly transport men and supplies from the densely populated east to the underpopulated west in only a matter of days, something Britain simply wouldn't be able to compete with. Perhaps most realistically, we could suppose that Britain simply never agrees to the policy of joint occupation, making Columbia exclusively British and forcing all Americans presently residing within its borders to either ship off back to the east or accept British rule. President Monroe, having seen the damage done by the War of 1812 as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War, could reasonably agree to concede the territory to Britain in exchange for a mutual demilitarization of the Canadian-American border, freeing up resources to be used in the more desirable Southwest and potentially acquire an entry into the Pacific through the conquest of Mexican lands. On the surface, while this might officially signal the beginning of positive relations between the two powers, internally there is likely to remain harsh feelings, especially within the United States, whose people may feel as though they had been cheated, stolen from, and even humiliated by Britain. This, paired with the economic panic of 1819, would bring an early end to the era of good feelings and drive the country to adopt more protectionist measures, as well as develop a skepticism of Britain and its North American possessions. As the United States grew into a larger, more self-sustaining and high-production country, so would Britain's skepticism begin to rise as well. Just as in our world, Britain would eventually come to recognize the US as a growing economic threat, and would actively seek to gain an upper hand over them by keeping the country isolated and divided. With the Oregon-Columbia territory in tow, an attempted containment country as the US as a growing economic threat, and would actively seek to gain an upper hand over them by keeping the country isolated and divided. With the Oregon-Columbia territory in tow, an attempted containment strategy may be implemented to keep the United States out of the Pacific, thus securing this market.
Look how far out Bermuda is, right? Isn't that Bermuda?
For the Empire, and making the US more manageable if ever were to initiate war. Now, Britain's initial ability to develop Colombia would be far higher than that of the US, as they could easily transport valuable cargo and resources to and from the colony by ship, not to mention ship in new settlers from Australia and abroad. That being said, Britain severely lacked the drive to densely populate this colony, at least as extensively as the US would have, and this is evidenced by their other settler colonies of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Canada's Anglo-Canadian population only having grown to surpass the French-Canadian population on account of fleeing loyalists from the 13 colonies, and Australia of course owing much of its initial settlement to its history as a penal colony for a then overpopulated England. Colombia would likely face a similar struggle.
Can I just say just something that I'm noticing, just how brilliantly strategic all of these colonies kind of are. They kind of just like are checkpoints that you can go to if they don't have lucrative, things inside of them like textiles or spices or natural resources, diamonds, coal, oil, rubber, whatnot. But it's like they got the UAE with access to the Persian Gulf with all the oil they have right there. Obviously, India, spices and textiles and whatnot. And then you got South Africa, obviously at the bottom of Africa as kind of that gateway into the Indian Ocean. And then you got the Falklands down here, kind of going down if you want to go through Cape Horn. Obviously, the Panama Canal changed that. Just interesting.
Was from the 13 colonies, and Australia, of course, owing much of its initial settlement to its history as a penal colony for a then overpopulated England. Colombia would likely face a similar struggle, however a desire to further secure the territory from further American encroachment might motivate more active settlement efforts. This had occurred for British Columbia in our timeline, though still the results were less than impressive. It likely wouldn't be until the end of the Mexican-American War, the American acquisition of the Southwest, and the discovery of gold in California that greater attention would be paid to British Columbia, seeing a spike in population both on account of the neighboring gold rush in Northern California and direct British efforts to prevent the rising American population just south of the border from forcibly annexing the colony. The Fraser Canyon gold rush of 1858 is sure to keep this growth momentum moving, giving the colony a very valuable gold rush of 1858 is sure to keep this growth momentum moving, giving the colony a very valuable population boost from Australia, Hawaii, Canada, and the United States. Having retained its most valuable settlements, the British Columbia of this world could be expected to be far richer and better developed than its real-life counterpart, expanding outside the fur market to develop fisheries, cattle ranches, mineral mines, and plantations, as it had begun to do shortly before the partition of our world. American settlement of California would also open up new coastal markets to conduct business with, though at the same time making clear an emerging rivalry for trade in the coastal Pacific. Remaining invested in Pacific North America, Britain may seek to expand its territorial holdings by purchasing Russian Alaska in the wake of the Crimean War, knowing well that Russia could not afford to defend the territory. Purchasing Russian. Remaining invested in Pacific North America, Britain may seek to expand its territorial holdings by purchasing Russian Alaska in the wake of the Crimean War, knowing well that Russia could not afford to defend the territory if Britain decided to invade it from Canada, that the region may very well hold valuable gold deposits, and that Russia would be in desperate need of immediate finances as it began its great reforms in the post-war era. By 1860, Britain would have built up Columbia and the western Canadian coast as a capable rival to the emerging American state of California, but it was clear that the United States was growing at a rate which Britain and its widespread colonies could not compete with. Very soon the US would displace Britain as the leading power in the Pacific, at which point the security of Colombia and Canada could not be guaranteed. But with the Civil War right on the horizon, California isolated from the rest of the United States as talks of constructing a transcontinental railroad had only just begun, and Britain strongly considering supporting the Confederacy just as they had in our world, it's quite possible the Civil War of this timeline would take on a more global character. The US of Z thanks you for watching, and a big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring
awesome
today's
video.
Squarespace is a platform which provides
I want to make sure you get his promo code.
Squarespace.com/MonsierZ. Save 10%
right there
on your first purchase of a website or domain. Links
Use the /MonsierZ.
Squarespace in the description. Support your legion by liking the video.
Do that for sure. Awesome video. Interesting topic. To be honest, I'm surprised. I guess maybe we saw the U.S. as, they saw the U.S. borders as big enough. But I'm surprised they didn't try to make more of a push to connect Alaska and Washington. But maybe they just didn't want any beef with the British and Canadians. Interesting video, though. Awesome. Sorry if I was a bit tired. Getting a bit long in the day, whatnot. See you next time.